Today, we will hear a review of Truth in Our Times by David E. McGraw, Deputy General Counsel of the New York Times. David Bradley, chairman of Atlantic Media, says Truth in Our Times outlines the best 25 behind-the-scenes stories from the New York Times newsroom since 9/11. Our presenter today is Jim Memmott, retired senior editor and author of the weekly Remarkable Rochester column for the Democrat and Chronicle. Please join me in welcoming Jim Memmott to our podium.
Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me? Kevin, can you hear me? It's so much fun to be here and to see old friends. There's Mary Hebron Smith, Kevin Hicks, and the extraordinary Dolores Orman. I haven't seen Dolores in a while, but Dolores was perhaps a contradiction in terms, a polite journalist. And beyond that, Dolores covered and knew the mob. And we had a big mob trial when I was executive city editor of the Democrat and Chronicle. There were about 12 of them were all on trial at the federal building, and these were the days before the digital camera. And we realized we didn't have mug shots of all of these men, all of whom have nicknames in the middle. And Dolores said, "Oh, I'll take care of that." And so they couldn't say no, Dolores. She had all 12 of the accused line up against the wall. It wasn't their first time in that posture. and we shot Burr Lewis, or one of our intrepid photographers, took the picture, and we suddenly had mugshots of all 12, who I think, Dolores, were they all convicted? I think so. They came and they went. But anyway, so my only advice to all of you is to be nice to Dolores. Anyway, in reviewing Truth in Our Times, this book by David McGraw, a lawyer and the general counsel, I guess, for the New York Times, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should first admit that I like and admire the New York Times. And I've been marginally employed by the New York Times. 40 years ago, when I was trying to write my way out of teaching at St. Lawrence University in the North Country, I started doing freelance work for the Watertown Daily Times, writing stories on out-of-the-way sports in the North Country. Those of you who've been to the North Country know that any activity is out of the way, but I parlayed this into writing stories about out-of-the-way things in the North Country for the New York Times, assembling clips that I could then show to editors who might possibly hire me. My first story was on a guy named Ken the Mad Canadian Carter, who had built a very tall ramp on the Canadian side of the St. Lawrence River, and he was going to drive a car up that ramp and then fly 1.5 miles to the American side. Aerodynamically, it was a stretch, but my first story was a charming feature of sorts about how the people of Waddington, the little town on the American side, would get together every Labor Day or so, take their picnic baskets down to the shore of the river and wait for Ken Carter, and he never showed up. I was teaching American literature, and I got a call, or Barbara McMillan, our department secretary, came. He says, "You have a call from the New York Times." Well, it turned out Ken was going to jump. As always, the New York Times in New York knew more than I did in Canton. So Barbara knew a friend who had a boat. So I went up to Waddington, met the friend, and he drove me into the St. Lawrence River. Security was a little looser then. And I got to the middle of the river, and there was an assemblage of people in a boat, and I realized, because I'd seen his picture, that one of them was Ken the Mad Canadian Carter. And I said, and this is my moment, this is when I peaked in journalism, literally. Before I had a career, I said, "Hi, I'm Jim Memmott from the New York Times. That was it. He never did jump, by the way. Someone, a Ken Carter lookalike, stole the car and drove it off the ramp, and it did make it to the shore, the Canadian shore. He hurt his back. Actually, I wrote most recently for the Times. I had a kind of minor subbeat with them, writing about Rochester welcoming Abby Wambach from her various soccer triumphs. And those were fun, and I would feel proud of myself. And I regretted that she retired. It's taking a little income away from me, but I'll always have the fountain in Geneseo. There's a pretty steady stream of cars that want to run into the fountain, and the editors at home base at the Democrat and Chronicle like stories about quaint villages with bizarre fountains in the middle of the street being run into by milk trucks. And so as soon as one hits, my friends alert me, Jim, there's another story. And since I know everybody by now, I don't have to even say I'm Jim Memmott, kind of a contract worker for the Democrat and Chronicle. But anyway, so I made clear that I like the New York Times, and I realized, and I should make clear, anyone who reads this book who doesn't like the New York Times won't like this book. And I should also admit that I like lawyers. I realize that makes me an outlier of sorts. I'm thinking that somewhere there are probably support groups for people who like lawyers. You sit in a circle and you say, my name is Jim, and I like lawyers. I was going to try to stretch this period with a series of lawyer jokes. It's funny that they have a whole class of jokes. What's the difference between a lawyer and God? God doesn't think he's a lawyer. That's the last one I'll do. There may be some lawyers in the room, and my apologies to them and to any gods in the room as well. Anyway, one of the reasons I like lawyers is that I had a kind of brief moment in my life when I was about ready to go to law school. After graduating from Hamilton College, it's an enormously tiny school in the middle of the state, where Utica was the fun place we went to, I was accepted to law school. And then I looked at the curriculum, and I noticed that they studied something called torts. And I realized I have no idea what torts is, but it didn't sound very interesting. And then I got a small scholarship at the last minute. I think I was like the sixth alternate. I could go study English in graduate school anywhere in the country. And reading about Shakespeare and Hemingway and Chaucer and those guys seemed a lot more interesting than reading about torts. So I went off to the University of Minnesota, where I froze for 7 years, and then to St. Lawrence University in northern New York, where I froze for 9 years, before jumping ship and becoming a reporter at the Rochester Times-Union. And then after 2 years of reporting, I moved to the city desk at the Times-Union. It was kind of a triumph of hope over experience. It's like remarriage, I guess they say. But remarriage has worked well for me. I advise the rest of you, if you want to give it a try, it's okay. But anyway, the reason they needed editors on the desk is all the other editors had defected to USA Today. They were starting USA Today. Al Newhart had taken the company south, and most of the talent went. But anyway, I worked there, and later, again, because people were moving around, I became the managing editor of the Times-Union, and then the Democrat and Chronicle. I've taken credit for driving the circulation down in both of those papers. So far, I've only written the obit for one of them, the Times-Union. But anyway, I moved a little away from heavy management roles in 1992, took a buyout in 2007, but it's Susan suggests, continue to write for them. I'm like one of those people who loses his job but still puts on his tie and goes to McDonald's every day, having lied to his family that I just, for some reason, just send them stuff. They pay me in the low three figures. I'm, of course, inflating it. But, anyway, it was during my time as executive city editor and then managing editor at both papers that I had a fairly consistent interaction with First Amendment lawyers like David McCraw. It was then I got to admire them, like them, and for the sake of the paper and my job, need them. The job of the newspaper lawyer is generally conducted behind the scenes. It really is. When you look at journalism movies, there's very seldom lawyers. You can watch all of All the President's Men and never meet a lawyer. You do meet lawyers in The Post, the very good movie about Katharine Graham and the republication of the Pentagon Papers. But the lawyers there have a kind of classic role of obstructionism. That is basically Ben Bradley and other people want to get the story out, and the lawyers keep coming up with ideas as to why they shouldn't. Anyway, the newspaper lawyers, in my memory, their role, his or her role, was to keep the paper itself out of the news, and often this was done by giving sound advice that prevents errors from getting into the paper, or in these days onto the website. Sometimes lawyers have a more public role as they defend stories that are under attack themselves. Now keep in mind, I was a newspaper in a pre-internet, pre-Trump era. I've managed to keep my column remarkably Rochester free of crime and free of Trump. And you wonder if this isn't almost an affectation, that is, as the world spins around, at least with Trump, there I am talking about deceased Rochesterians. But I'm more comfortable with that. Anyway, in some ways, my schooling in newspaper law and my contact with lawyers may seem out of date, a remnant from a different, perhaps better time. Nonetheless, a look back allows us to get some key terms in mind, just as it offers a helpful contrast between then and now. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Democrat and the Times Union were often represented by the then firm of Nixon Hargrave. And within that firm, Jack McCrory, Bob Bernius, and somewhat less often Bill Brandt gave advice and representation. Mostly they looked out for instances of possible libel, keeping possibly defamatory statements, the sort that can lead to lawsuits, out of the paper. They also defended libel suits, though we didn't have to face that many, perhaps because they were good at putting out those fires before publication. Now, we had a ton of good reporters at the paper, aggressive reporters and reporters who had sources and reporters who wanted to get things into the paper. So there's always somewhat of a tension between the editor and who's putting a few brakes on a story sometimes, and the reporter, and then between the attorney and the editor. But I look back, it's just some. In addition to Dolores Orman, Laurie Bennett, an amazingly good investigative reporter, Sherry Jacobson, the great Sue Smith, who was just an astonishing reporter, and took us into areas of medical subjects, which were always tricky and often needed lawyers. Carol Eisenberg, later Steve Orr, and now I read Gary Craig's stuff, and I'm just envious. It would be so much fun to be working with him. And there's many, many more. Megan McDermott, Justin Murphy on the school district now. But a lot of those stories are stories that are probably lawyered, though I don't know. Anyway, one of my chief charges was the late Jay Gallagher, who was probably one of the best investigative reporters to work at the Times Union. He went off to run the Albany Bureau for Gannett and sadly died to pancreatic cancer far too young. At one point, he was digging into the activities of a local minister who led a church with a wide variety of activities, some of them highly suspicious. He had several off-the-record sources, but not many supporting documents. Lawyers love papers, court papers, and so on. Jack McCrory told us that he felt he would have a hard time defending the story if we were sued. There were few witnesses willing to give up anonymity and testify in court. There were few public records to help tie down assertions. McCrory didn't say he wouldn't defend it. That was key, just that it would be hard. He was always good at that because they realized as lawyers their job really wasn't to make the final call on whether a story got into the paper. In McCraw's book, he only gives one instance where it was actually his call. For all the other times, it's the publisher's call, the editor's call, but the lawyers advise. Anyway, when McCrory said he thought he couldn't defend it, both Jay and I gulped. That was as good as saying, stop, think it through. So he toned down the story to buy time. He kept plugging. He got more on the record. And all of his work actually led to an arrest and a conviction. But without McCrory's hesitancy, that probably wouldn't have happened. Quite often we, like McCraw in his book, were worried about committing a libel, being sued for libel and having to defend a possible libel. If I'd gone to law school, I would have learned that libel is a civil offense. You get sued for committing a libel, you don't get arrested. The fact that there are libel laws shows that the First Amendment guarantee of free speech, while very broad in the United States, is not absolute. You can write anything you want, but sometimes you do it at your own risk. There are lots of definitions of libel, but for our purposes, it's a published false statement that damages reputation. A published false statement that damages reputation. The three legs of that stool are important. The statement has to be published, it has to be false, and it has to damage reputation. Usually the first leg is easy to prove. As publication can be anything as simple as a phrase on a poster. The second leg, the falsity of the statement, is key. If the statement, however damning, is true, a libel hasn't occurred. Phrased more commonly, truth is the best defense against libel. The third leg, damage to reputation, is sometimes easy to prove. People lose a job after a falsehood about them is posted online. Their friends shun them. Their tarnished reputation is the reason. Another way of looking at the reputation issue is outlined in McCraw's response to a letter from Donald Trump's lawyers in October 2015. They alleged that an article in which two women were quoted as saying Trump had touched them inappropriately constituted what's known as libel per se. It automatically lowered Trump's reputation. McCraw responded in a letter that went viral and was actually on the back of his book. He's so proud of it. That because Trump had already bragged publicly about, quote, non-consensual touching of women, and boasted in other ways about conduct like that would seem inappropriate, that, quote, nothing in the article has the slightest effect on the reputation that Mr. Trump, through his own words and actions, has already created for himself. In other words, Trump had created a situation where he had no good reputation to lose. Now, that doesn't keep Trump from saying that he's going to sue for libel. But in point of fact, he, like most people in his position, wouldn't win. I can't recall many libel state cases that went to trial when I was editing, but one that did is perhaps instructive. A small item in the Times-Union had declared a local restaurant owner as having declared bankruptcy, had described him as having declared bankruptcy. He filed a libel suit saying that the story was false. It was the corporation that owned the restaurant that went bankrupt, he said, not himself. And he added that being labeled a bankrupt had caused him pain and suffering. The case went to trial. I think Bob Bernius represented us and was eventually dismissed. The judge had agreed that the item was published. That was easy. And that it was false. That was a little harder. But the plaintiff didn't show that his reputation was damaged. Indeed, he showed the opposite. He had enough income on hand to start a new restaurant. His friends testified to his good character. But let me stress, he was a good person who had suffered. The story did do damage. It just wasn't damage covered by the law. As McCraw makes clear, libel is a little more complex when it pertains to public officials or public figures. They have to prove that a false and damaging statement was published with something called actual malice. That means that the media source didn't check the information or that it knew a statement was wrong and it still went ahead. In making it harder for public officials to sue, the Supreme Court in 1964 supported the notion that in a democracy, debate should be free and generally unrestrained. Justice Brennan, God rest his soul, wrote of the, quote, profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that it may include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. Sometime in the 1980s, long after Times versus Sullivan, the 1964 case, became ingrained in the law, Peter Taub of the Times Union, my late and good friend, noted that several, perhaps even 5, of the judges on the local courts wore toupees. Peter was a gentle soul and normally didn't poke fun at others, but he thought it would be amusing to do a column on the toupee-topped 5, complete with headshots. I went along with him, and the column ran to general public approval. So as armchair libel lawyers know, the column was libel-proof. The judges wore rugs. Truth is the best defense. But say there was one who still had his own hair, and that unfortunate justice had been teased by his court clerk after the column appeared. His normally full self-esteem had shrunk away, and his nomination to serve on a higher court was withdrawn. We at the Times Union would have felt secure because the judge is, after all, a public official, and as long as we could show that we published the column thinking he had a toupee, we were okay. Again, life in this case, and maybe libel law, too, isn't fair. I mentioned earlier that Jay Gallagher had several off-the-record sources in the Minister story. There are all sorts of reasons why sources don't want their names in the paper. Fear of reprisal, losing a job, embarrassment, and many more. At the same time, anonymous sources pose problems, not just for newspaper lawyers and editors, but for readers and the subjects of stories. The lawyers and editors these days demand really to know who the anonymous sources are so they can get a sense of their credibility. And they also want to know if the sources are willing to go public if the paper gets sued. Readers are suspicious of anonymous sources as they believe they may be made up. Donald Trump riffed on the theme of anonymous sources in one of his appearances. Actually, he does this a lot, citing a story that he said had 9 anonymous sources. He argued there could not have been 9. He was in the room after all. He counted. Trump was disingenuous, I think, but kind of on target, especially when he wondered how the members of his audience would feel if they were subject of anonymous attacks. Ordinary people attacked in this way would have little recourse. And to be honest, Trump is not alone. His editors at prominent media outlets, including USA Today, have long railed against the use of anonymous sources. And yet so much of political reporting, and reporting on subjects including sexual abuse, depends at least on some not anonymous sources. In my journalism class, we went back and read one of the original Washington Post Watergate stories by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. All the charges in the story, including the charge that former Attorney General John Mitchell controlled the money that financed the Watergate break-in, are attributed to anonymous sources. As time went on, it was shown that all the charges were true. In Truth in Our Time, McCraw accepts the use of anonymous sources. There's no scene where McCraw or Dean Baquet, the paper's ultimate editor, screams, "God damn it, when is somebody going to go on the record in this story?" as Ben Bradley, Jason Robards barks in the movie version of All the President's Men. I just wish I'd said that once. It's like I never said stop the presses. So there I was. I peaked in 1978 with Jim Memmott from the New York Times. I never said, when is anyone going to go on the record? And I never stopped the presses. Failure. McCraw's acceptance of anonymous sources no doubt reflects the reality of covering politics in the age of Trump. Essentially, McCraw finds himself in a game, a very serious game, where all the rules have been ignored, where once there was a belief in facts, there are now alternative facts, where once reporters were at least tolerated as they went about their jobs, now they are penned in at rallies and taunted by a crowd whipped up by the most powerful person in the world. Beyond that, editors are being whipsawed by the news that is often driven online by people who have no allegiance to accuracy or fair play. And in the monetary wars that are plaguing journalism, the New York Times can afford David McCraw, but most small newspapers can't. So you think twice about risking the paper's income by taking on the local Harvey Weinstein. Even at the Times, the need for clicks and social media presence has blurred the traditional line between reporting and commentary. So it's hard for McCraw to make the statement that the paper is completely unbiased in what it covers and what it writes in its news sections. Maggie Haberman covers Trump, but she also stars as Maggie Haberman. Michael Barbaro, an extraordinary reporter, has become an economic engine on the Daily, a Times superstar. And of course, the media is split up into sides. Fox News on the right, MSNBC on the left. Where does that leave David McCraw in this book? I think it leaves him trying to prove, and I think he does, that the Times is still doing the people's work and that it matters that it is. To make his point, he uses a kind of case studies approach, focusing on a series of high-profile stories that raise some of the issues we've talked about. Most, but not all, of the stories are Trump-related. Thus, McCraw devotes 2 chapters to the 2016 Times story that shows how Trump carried over from year to year a portion of a one-time $900 million loss, avoiding to have to pay any taxes at all for several, perhaps many years. The story begins when a portion of the 1995 tax return shows up in reporter Suzanne Craig's mailbox. McCraw allows that it would seem that the paper thus received confidential information it wasn't supposed to have. He then notes, legalistically because he's a lawyer, that while it may have been illegal for someone, an IRS official, to steal the report, it's not illegal for the paper to receive it. As in the Pentagon Papers, as in WikiLeaks, the paper is safe, he hopes, from prosecution. He worries about that. There's a section in this book. Traditionally, the paper is not subject to prosecution, but the leaker is. He worries that the Trump administration would employ the Espionage Act and to say that the reporter was committing an act of espionage by publishing. Anyway, Trump's team tried to discourage the Times from publishing, saying the document had been illegally obtained, that the Times was simply acting as an arm of the Clinton campaign. But then Donald Trump later sort of confirmed the story, which the Times published without reprisal. In his account of the 2016 tax story, McCraw is careful to show to what lengths the Times reporters went to pin down the facts. They make it attack-proof. Of course, the reporters were proceeding with an assumption I share, that Donald Trump's taxes, so long promised, so long held back, should have been made public. They haven't been, despite the paper's best efforts. The reality is the Times' continued interest in Trump's taxes. They won a Pulitzer Prize with the 2010 story on the Trump family taxes. That interest is not shared by a majority of the public. I've never heard him say this, and maybe I'm wrong, but it may be that when Donald Trump calls stories like the Times pieces on his taxes fake news, he isn't saying the news itself is false, so much as he's saying it isn't news, that interest in his taxes isn't worthy of attention, that there is real news to be found elsewhere. But even in saying this, I begin to disagree with myself. It's not easy figuring Donald Trump out. McCraw makes it clear that Trump exercises his First Amendment rights with a vengeance. He won't shut up. And in taking advantage of his First Amendment rights, Trump undermines the press's First Amendment duty to get at the truth. There was a time before he wrote his book when McCraw didn't thus feel threatened by Trump. That time is past. Quote, all the things I'd believed in to be self-evident about the place of press freedom in America, its values, its necessity, its centrality to democracy, were under siege and no longer seemed certain, McCraw writes. There was a war going on for the hearts and minds of the American people, and like it or not, America's press was pinned down in the middle of it. I should also make clear, while Donald Trump looms over the book, it's not all about Trump. There is, for example, discussion of the Times publication of material from Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and there's a fascinating chapter on the lead role the Times took in breaking the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse story. That story came about because two reporters contacted the right sources and because those sources were willing to share off the record at first accounts of the appalling ways they had been treated. The story moved up a notch for sure when the actress Ashley Judd agreed to go public with her complaint. It was then that McCraw knew it was over for Weinstein. Speaking of lawyers, in his Weinstein chapter, McCraw presents a discouraging picture of some of the lawyers, among them David Boies, whom Weinstein hired to intimidate not just the women who had complaints against Weinstein, but the Times and its reporters as well. Boies' firm hired a private eye to basically get dirt on the reporters. Boies' firm was also employed by the New York Times at the same time to do other work. It seems like a conflict of interest. McCraw fired him. But let me make it, anyway, there's some lawyers I turn away not liking, but let me make it clear. I found myself liking Donald McCraw, not only because he's on the side of reporters I respect and champions issues I hold dear. It's a troubling book and a troubling time, but it holds out the possibility that with good reporting, good editing, and good lawyering, a word I can't say, real facts and real news will win out. We can only hope. Thank you.